Good morning. Thanks, Charles, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you who could make it nice and early today. So I intend to speak for about 40 minutes. Let's just check the acoustics. And after that, I hope we'll open to Q&A, and that will last for about 15-20 minutes. So hopefully it will be worth your time. As the region that we're covering today is enormous, I'm going to focus on some key issues. In terms of setting the agenda, I think many of the questions are on your invite, so this shouldn't be completely new to you, but the key questions that we'll be addressing today are the drivers of Russia's behavior in the Caucasus and the Caspian and Central Asia. We will be looking at whether Russia is resurgent or if it's militant and imperialistic, as many newspapers tend to claim these days. We will then be looking at how the regional states have responded to Russia's behavior, because I think all too often it's assumed that regional states are somehow passive takers of Russia's policy, and I think it's worth discussing that in a little bit more detail. Finally, we will look at some plausible scenarios that may play out in the Caspian and Central Asia, and we'll look at some key risks and opportunities. Charles, is there a way to make this work? No, on this one. Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay. I thought before we start the discussion, it's worth reminding everyone what the region looks like, with some key pipelines on the map. But more importantly, and as you'll notice throughout this lecture, I'd like to keep referring to the strategic importance of the region, and more specifically, the importance of the Caspian for the Middle East. For example, if you look at the proximity to Syria and Afghanistan, and then the proximity of Central Asia to Afghanistan as well as China, and generally the importance of all of these regions for Russia's military strategic thinking, as well as obviously energy thinking. But many of you come from that sort of background, whereas the military strategic aspect might be slightly new to some of you. So with that in mind, I think the first thing that we need to discuss today is the Caspian Convention. As Charles started discussing, this is hugely significant, and not least because it's been in the making for over 20 years. And it seemed, I remember talking to people saying that even in July this year, and the convention was signed in August, in July some people still thought it wouldn't happen. So it did happen, and therefore I think it's important to discuss it in terms of what sort of agreement we have, what sort of things have been left out, what sort of things have been included, and of course what sort of light it sheds on Russia's interests in the region. So the key thing to know, and it's not on the slide, is that the Caspian status has been agreed, and it's neither a lake nor a sea. And that's quite interesting, because it's fully in line with Russia's interests. This is exactly what Russia has been lobbying for over 20 years. So that's the key point to which the littoral states have agreed, and we will now discuss why they've agreed to this. So one thing that has been agreed is that is the territorial waters of the Caspian. So that will be 15 nautical miles off the shore of each littoral state, plus the 10-mile fishing zone. So 25 miles in total, and keep that number in mind. We will come back to it in just a second. The remaining central waters are to be shared between all littoral states. Again, this is very much in line with what Russia has been demanding all along. What has been left out? You will see from the way the seabed has been demarcated that some borders have been set and some haven't. So the seabed between Kazakhstan, Russia, and Azerbaijan is set. Those borders have been set for a long time. The first agreement was signed back in 1998, followed by 2001, and then there was a trilateral agreement between the three states in the northern Caspian agreeing the demarcation of the seabed. Now, again, this applies only to the resources of the seabed, whereas the waters above were to be governed together. Now, what has been left out of the convention is the demarcation of the southern Caspian, but there was a clause that has been included that the states will agree those issues bilaterally. In other words, this is to be negotiated between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan and Iran and Turkmenistan. One of the reasons why this is important is because there are quite a few fields, energy fields, both oil and gas, which are contested. If we look at what has happened in the northern Caspian, you can see that it's a modified median line, which explains why the ownership of some fields falls under the sovereignty of Russia and others under the sovereignty of Kazakhstan. The disputed fields, according to the agreements of 1998 and 2001, are to be governed, are to be governed jointly, which means that there is a 50-50% interest in the three previously disputed fields. The fields are Kurmangazi, which is under the sovereignty of Kazakhstan, and Centralna and Khvalinskaya, the two fields which fell under the sovereignty of Russia. So it's not inconceivable that similar agreement will be worked out for the South Caspian, and in fact, as we will talk about a little bit later on in the lecture, this is exactly the direction in which this has been heading. But in terms of what has been left out, the details about the ownership haven't been worked out and are to be left for future negotiations on a bilateral basis between the states. Now, let's look at key demands and outcomes. I think this is paramount for our discussion today, because all the analysis that I've seen in the press emphasize that Russia has made a big concession on the Trans-Caspian pipeline, as in, according to the convention, the Trans-Caspian pipeline can be built, the construction of it becomes legally possible. Russia has denounced its right to use the veto. That's great, and that's not incorrect. However, if you look at Russia's key gains, they are significantly greater than the concession that it made. And here I'd like to take you back to the 1950s when Russia developed the closed sea doctrine. And the closed sea doctrine says that no foreign ships, no foreign naval bases are to be set up in the Caspian. In other words, precluding the access from the outside, and in our case from the United States or the West, has always been paramount. And we know that Russia has been very keen to preclude any military presence in the Caspian, and so this is exactly what it gets with this convention. Yeah, there is a clause which says specifically that foreign ships, foreign naval bases are to be excluded, and therefore when Putin introduced the Caspian Convention, he said that this is a big step forward. The convention sets the guidelines for the Caspian and gives exclusive rights to the littoral states. So again, you can see that yes, a concession has been made. However, the gains have been significantly larger. The Caspian flotilla is small but potent, has demonstrated that it's very capable. It has been recently modernized. Over 85% of it has now been either modernized or new ships have been acquired. It will continue to be modernized until it's 100% modern and capable, and this will happen by 2020, so it's on track to meet that schedule. So naval supremacy on the Caspian is guaranteed for Russia, and that's a key gain. I hope we all agree here that this is the gain versus the concession that has been made. But let's come back to the issue of the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline. I, for one, am not at all convinced that there is need for Turkmen gas in Europe. We will talk about the need in China, but if we are talking about bringing Turkmen gas all the way across the Caspian, and perhaps that pipeline joining, or more likely a new parallel pipeline to be built alongside the existing pipeline that goes through Georgia into Turkey and on to Europe, then at the moment there are simply quite a few competitors to Turkmen gas, and Turkmen gas is simply too expensive. So the key competitors, which didn't exist 20 years ago, have now come online. You don't need me to tell you that obviously there's the Egyptian field of Zohra, that there's the US LNG, there will be a Russian gas coming from Turk Stream, even if it's marginally larger volumes, redirected from Ukraine, there will still be capacity to supply more to Southern Europe, as well as to the rest of Europe. But in other words, there's simply no need for Turkmen gas. And therefore, the concession then seems even less meaningful. Yeah, and let's not forget that there is still a clause in the convention that says that Russia may oppose it or express its discontent, as can do all other littoral states, on environmental grounds. And therefore, there is still that ability, not to veto, but to delay the construction, if needed. And then if we look at the role of regional states, I think, as I mentioned before, way too often it's taken for a given that states are passive, they're smaller than Russia, and therefore they will somehow play a role where they concede to what Russia argues. However, if you look at how much the states have achieved, it's quite remarkable. If you look at Russia's position back in the 1990s, it argued in the UN that the Caspian Sea, should be a condominium. Now, let me remind you that this is very close to Iranian position. Yeah, this is what Tehran has always argued in favor of joint governance of the Caspian, of condominium, and this is one thing that it shared with Russia. However, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan successfully made a case for the application of customary law. They argued that, in fact, if you look at established practice in the Caspian was always divided into sectors. So there was a Soviet sector, and there was the Iranian sector, and the Soviet sector was subdivided, divided into subsectors between the republics, which enjoyed exclusive rights of mining in their respective zones. So they were able to push through that argument, and they successfully used various tactics, including using divisions within the Russian government to promote that. And as you saw, as I mentioned, in 1998, the seabed was divided, which set a precedent. And what scenarios for dividing the Southern Caspian are likely? So I'm very keen, I believe strongly that the precedents set by Russia and Azerbaijan, and then Russia and Kazakhstan, are good ones and are likely to be applied in the South Caspian. There are reasons to believe that this is already underway. So I've recently conducted a round of field work where I understand that this has been the tendency, especially since the announcement of US sanctions, renewal of US sanctions on Iran. So Tehran has been talking to the leaderships of Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan about joint development of the contested fields, and obviously publicly it's well known that Iranian officials have been regularly going to the region, and officials at the highest level discussing those issues. Interestingly enough, the fields haven't been named, in part because they're called different things in different states, but we all understand which fields they mean. So this is kind of going to what I was discussing, but that's the modified median line, which again is likely to be adopted in the future. Now, let's cover drivers of Russian behavior, because all too often this is misunderstood. We've already discussed that Russia wants to minimize US, NATO military presence in the region, in fact, all kinds of presence, but particularly military presence. And the convention allays some of those concerns. Obviously, it's a significant gain for Russia. However, the issue of transit corridors for cargoes going to Afghanistan remains an issue. So just before the signing of the convention in May, Kazakhstan amended its legislation allowing for the use of Caspian ports for the transit of more cargo through its territory en route to Afghanistan. And Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia, immediately raised concerns at the CSTO meeting, which is a collective security treaty organization, and he said that this contravenes the spirit of the convention, to which Kazakhstan responded immediately that it doesn't, because all the transportation of cargoes will be conducted by local vessels, and as such, there won't be any US, NATO, or Western ships in the region. So I think it's quite clever the way regional states bypass different treaties and have been doing for a long time. But nonetheless, the convention, which has now been signed by all littoral states, gives Russia that ability to pressure the states some more in the future. So for any expanded US presence, there'll be a lot stiffer resistance from Moscow. Now, in terms of precluding color revolutions, we can talk about it for probably another hour, but I won't. We all know that they started in Georgia, and the Kremlin likes to refer to them as color revolutions. Started in 2003 with the Rose Revolution, followed by the Orange Revolution the following year in Ukraine, and then the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. So all of this raised significant concerns in the Kremlin. Let's not forget that after vote rigging for parliamentary elections in 2010, 2011 in Russia, the Kremlin was genuinely concerned about the scale of protests that took place across Russia. So that was really an alarm bell, after which I see that that color revolutions, precluding color revolutions, has been included into Russia's policy quite specifically. Yeah, so if previously it was ad hoc reactionary attempts to preclude such events, then after 2011 it became a very specific policy of the Russian leadership. And another driver of behavior that we need to discuss here is the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, drugs trafficking. This applies primarily to Central Asia. Much can be said about this once again, but let me just give you one example. Tajikistan obviously has a long border with Afghanistan, and when under the pressure from the Tajik leadership in 2004, the Tajik border troops withdrew, the Russian border troops withdrew from Tajikistan. The international community stepped up assistance. However, and this is not my conclusion, this is the conclusion of people who worked on the ground collecting data, the evidence shows that because they didn't know the details and the specificity of the political criminal nexus in Tajikistan, the number of drug seizures actually came down. So the trafficking increased and caused genuine concern across the world, in the international community included, but certainly in Russia. And then in December 2009, Russia stepped back in and started offering military aid and support and advisors to try and strengthen that border. So, I mean, the cooperation obviously has its problems, but nonetheless, they know the region, and it has been to an extent effective in reducing drugs trafficking. It continues to be an issue, and that's what we need to know for the purposes of this discussion. Regional stability, I think this is a paramount objective of Moscow in Central Asia. We need to understand that a lot of people just by inertia call Russian policy across the region, imperialistic, expansionist. But in all the interviews that I've conducted, in all the research that I've conducted, I've come across a very strong feeling that Central Asia is a region which has so many problems that in a way it needs to be somehow contained rather than expanded into. So even though there are certain tendencies in different factions, in different parts of the Russian leadership, and certain loud statements can be made, overall I think the idea is that it needs to be, NATO and US has to be excluded, and they have to be excluded, whereas overall the problems such as drugs trafficking and Islamic fundamentalism need to be contained, and that's the main objective for the region. And that's the Central Asian region, not so much the Caspian. The Caspian is different in nature. Now, if we look at Russia's efforts to improve its standing as a global power, of course the region is instrumental in helping it to do that. And therefore, it will continue to try and exercise influence across the region. It wants to gain international recognition of its leading role in the region. However, as we will see slightly later on, it's quite realistic that it's not the only actor in the region, and it has come to accept it. Nonetheless, it will continue to assert itself in certain areas. Now, the next slide shows Russia's arsenal of tools, which I think is important to discuss because these are the tools that Russia uses to advance its objectives. Regional organizations and treaties, this is not controversial, you all know that. Russia uses regional organizations. Let me name just a few. CSTO, which is Collective Security Treaty Organization, is an obvious example. There is also the relatively recently set up Eurasian Economic Union. Treaties include such as the conventions such as the Caspian Convention. And generally, Russia has been using them to promote its influence. Military facilities, arms sales, and military cooperation is a much harder subject, and so let's dwell on it for just a few seconds. Military facilities, Russia has military facilities across Central Asia, of course not comparable to what it used to have under the Soviets. Nonetheless, they are significant. The largest non-naval military facility is in Tajikistan still, and there is also a base in Kyrgyzstan and facilities in Kazakhstan. There is also a base in Armenia. And obviously we're not even mentioning the breakaway republics where Russia always has troops. The arms sales is an obvious point which enhances the influence of Russia, but military cooperation, I want to dwell on this because it's so often missed in all the analysis that I see. Military cooperation is important and has been taking place regularly. However, while the Western media talks about Vostok 2018 exercises, there were massive CSTO drills taking part across Central Asia, including Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Russia proper. So Combat Brotherhood 2018 had multiple components. Those are the names of the drills. They had multiple components, just like Vostok 2018. And one was the air component, the other one was search and rescue, and there was drugs trafficking, and so on and so forth. They were completed in October. Over 2,000 troops took part in those drills, yet no attention was paid in the media to those drills. And therefore, I'd like to draw your attention to this because it's clearly one way of projecting influence. Military interventions, the much feared peacekeepers that Russia likes to introduce, translated from Russian, it's peace-creating missions, which everyone understands are the means to manipulate conflicts to their advantage. The 5-day war with Georgia was an instance where Russia showed itself willing and able to use blatant military power. Let's not get this wrong. Russia performed disastrously from the military point of view in the Russia-Georgia war. It still won the war, but against Georgia, which what were the odds? However, from the military point of view, it performed disastrously, and it triggered a whole series of military reforms on the Russian side. The assessment from the military leadership was that the army is completely unprepared for a modern war. Nonetheless, the point here is that Russia is prepared to show that it will use military means to achieve its objectives across the region. Economic cooperation across the sectors, I mean, we can talk about this for an hour. So all I will say here is let's not underestimate the enormity of economic dependence that comes from remittances. So because of the large percentage that, compared to GDP of Central Asian economies, that the citizens of Central Asia send back to their respective home countries, the economic dependency, which has been there since the 90s, continues. In fact, with the collapse of the oil prices after 2014, the remittances went down, but I've seen the latest data from the Russian Central Bank, and they've picked right back up. From Kyrgyzstan, for example, remittances or from Kyrgyz citizens to back to Kyrgyzstan from Russia are up 30%, Uzbekistan 40%, and Tajikistan something like 35%. So enormous compared to their GDPs, and therefore the economic dependency is there and has been there, and again is a means of manipulating the countries. And for many, obviously, people on the ground, it's the lifeline, and therefore we need to take that factor into account. Working with the Chinese to keep out the West. We'll talk about it a little bit later, just hold that thought, I'll come back to it. Build, maintain relations with regional elites. I'd like to just bring up one example here, because when there was succession after the Turkmen and Uzbek leaders, when they died, obviously Niyazov and Karimov respectively, there was a period of power transition. Now, what I found really remarkable is that the European governments really struggled to even understand who's next in line, who might be the potential successor. Well, when I was interviewing people in the foreign ministry of Russia, they said to me that it was diplomacy by swamping from Russia. So quite literally it translates diplomacy by swamping, because they just kept sending high-ranking officials to negotiate the best outcome. Putin himself went to Tashkent. So, this is all very illustrative of how Russia does business compared to the West. Soft power tools. Wow. So, soft power tools. There is a major misunderstanding between what soft power means and how we define it in the West and how Russia defines it. So completely different things, same term, mean totally different things, introduced into the Russian discourse after 2012, has subsequently been integrated into lots of strategic documentation, and basically means manipulating countries from within. So whereas in the West we think that soft power is somehow a way to avoid conflict and smooth things out and use NGOs to promote democracy, for Russia, it's very clear. We use a whole range of tools to manipulate certain outcomes to our advantage. I mean, this is there in strategic documentation. So let's leave it at that. Let's talk about the impact of decision-making. The impact of decision-making has been colossal. In one sentence, there was phase one when under Yeltsin it was passive and reactionary. Then there was phase two when it suddenly gained importance and people with military background, people with security services background became quite prominent in decision making. That happened under Putin's first presidency. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not falling into the usual trap of saying Putin just appointed people he works with. There were genuine security concerns in Central Asia. Therefore, military and security services personnel were appointed to deal with security tasks. However, appointing those people then in turn created the impact of securitizing decision-making. So then in turn those security decisions were given prominence and all the other interests became subordinate. including energy interests. And, I remember when I was working with Lukoil, it was perfectly clear that Lukoil would make sure that its interests are aligned with those of the Kremlin. So let's just leave it at that, because I think we might start running out of time. Interestingly enough, there is no strategy document on the Caucasus or Central Asia. If you look at the Russian maritime doctrine, the Caspian direction features quite prominently. Nonetheless, there's no single document, perhaps because of the disparity of interests across Caucasus. The policy has to be necessarily highly differentiated, but also because there are valid reasons for not producing a single document. Economic interests, like I said, important but subordinated to strategic interests of the state, and military security and geopolitical interests continue to dominate. Now, if we talk about likely scenarios, obviously military security will continue to dominate, as I think you're all following from this analysis. Competition in gas. This is interesting because Russia didn't preclude the construction of the Southern Gas Corridor, which you see on the map. Russia will continue to compete for European gas markets. However, the attention has now shifted and is significantly more on precluding the coming of US LNG onto the market. And therefore, there is a lot less interest in what volumes will be sent. Besides, it's a fait accompli at the moment. So Shah Deniz 2 will be sending volumes, has started sending volumes to Turkey, and as production ramps up, obviously will be sending volumes further down to Europe. And TAP is being that last leg is being built at the moment. So, I mean, we can dwell on energy national security nexus, but perhaps if there is interest in that, just ask me later. Clearly, we all understand that that energy and national security are very closely interlinked in Russian analysis of how its interests should be promoted, and I think a key point to take away from this is that Russia will continue to compete for European markets. This pipeline is now there. It will continue sending volumes to Europe, and there is, I personally don't see demand in Europe on the scale that will make the Trans-Caspian pipeline viable, not in the short term, not in the medium term, so perhaps just in very long term. But that's a different discussion. Sino-Russian cooperation is, again, one thing that frequently gets missed and misunderstood, because it's just assumed that China and Russia somehow always compete, only ever compete. And I'd like to argue against this hypothesis. I'd like to suggest that Russia and China compete. However, they also have lots of areas where they've started coordinating their interests. And in fact, I wouldn't quite call it division of labor, but there is definitely some areas in which China is stronger, and there are some areas in which Russia has reserved its primary role and is quite keen to defend it. So let's have a look. China has undeniable economic advantages in Central Asia. FDI is an area in which Russia simply can't compete with China. There's no doubt. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. Infrastructure to connect different parts of Central Asia. That has been well underway, and lots of projects have been implemented to enable connections, better connections. And again, Russia wouldn't have engaged in that, simply doesn't have the resources, financial or political, to keep that as a priority project, whereas quite a lot has been undertaken in the context, in the framework of the One Belt, One Road initiative, which obviously is a 1 trillion initiative, and part of it is to do with reviving the Silk Route across Central Asia. Trade, investment, again, China's priority, and I would say that China has emerged as the leading player in energy, in the pipeline construction included. Russia can still capitalize on whatever it has inherited from the Soviets, including the extensive infrastructure of pipelines, such as Central Asia center pipelines. However, China has been building pipelines, and the one that I would like to point out to you is the one that you see here. So don't look at the top pipeline, look at the bottom gas pipeline here, which takes gas all the way from Turkmenistan across Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and on to China. Now, the capacity of that pipeline is 55 BCM, billion cubic meters, and we expect the pipeline capacity to be 100% utilized this year. So this has now given rise to speculation that line D, which is the fourth line, which was in the pipeline, which was being discussed some years ago and was subsequently dropped, may now be revived. And so the capacity of that pipeline, the total capacity may go up in the near future. So there are apparently already discussions underway. But what I'm saying is that Russian gas will be going to China via the Power of Siberia pipeline, which is being constructed. However, Turkmenistan also has an outlet to China, and there may be some competition depending on how much those pipelines from Turkmenistan are expanded. However, when Russia stopped buying Turkmen gas, this was the only way for the Turkmen regime to make any money. So they were sending some gas to Iran. However, that subsequently also stopped, and the volumes are quite minor, whereas these volumes are substantial. That, of course, creates dependence on China, but that's a different issue. So what we're saying here is that definitely China has engaged in the region, has become a prominent player, and will continue to be a prominent player because of its energy needs and its ability to finance projects which Russia simply doesn't have. So Russian reaction has been quite interesting. When I was having interviews again in the foreign ministry, the deputy foreign minister actually told me that that they accept that they're not the only players in the region, that obviously in Central Asia, the key would be to make sure that the influence of the West is minimized. However, they accept that China has almost legitimate interest in the area, and therefore the way forward is to work out how these interests can be reconciled. This is not, of course, a view which is shared by everyone. However, it was quite interesting to hear it. What we're seeing now is that Russia has focused primarily in the military security domain. We have had news, I think in May, that a new base will be set up in Kyrgyzstan. What's interesting is that it's being set up on the request of the Kyrgyz authorities, which is quite unusual. Like I said earlier in the lecture, there is already one base, so this would be the second base in Kyrgyzstan, which would promote and enhance Russia's presence and influence across Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan invited Russian troops, and it's highly likely to happen very soon. In fact, Russia hesitated for a while, but now a decision appears to have been made, and a new base will be set up. Now, in terms of counter-terrorist efforts, this is something that Russia has been engaging in, and in fact, partly this has been to please Beijing. Beijing doesn't want to engage in that sort of activity. It tries to kind of keep its interests economic, but it does have unrest on the other side, on its territory, and therefore kind of precluding the spillover would be highly desirable for Beijing. And so again, this is a common interest that Beijing and Moscow have shared. Then another thing that I picked up on was in the SCO is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by Beijing and Moscow. In their discussions in May, it was interesting that the parties openly discussed how to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan without the United States. So, whether or not this will lead to anything is a different matter, but the fact that they openly discussed resolving the Afghan problem, the issue of the Taliban without the United States was quite significant, I thought. So this just shows that there are quite a few areas in which the states, China and Russia, cooperate. And by expanding its military presence, I think Russia is really laying down the marker and saying that this is where China needs to back off. Like, this is the line. This is where it will continue to exercise its traditional influence, and it will not allow China to progress its interests in the military security domain. Nonetheless, in economic domain, there is quite a bit of potential for expansion. How are we doing for time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. In that case, I'll cover the nuclear. So I really thought whether or not I should introduce this case study, but basically, when I thought about how we will take this lecture, I thought that obviously military security interests is what I want you to take away from this lecture. Nonetheless, I do not want you to think that military security is all Russia cares about. And again, all too often, people just think that all interests would fall under the umbrella of military security interests. So here, I'd like to give you the example of Rosatom, which is the company which controls all civil nuclear assets of Russia. And it's a vertically integrated company, obviously. And its strategy is set very much by the state. So in that respect, there is significant influence over what the company needs to accomplish. When I looked at the strategy of Rosatom by 2030, several things stood out. The company is trying to become one of the top three world leaders in every segment of the global nuclear market. And this is hugely significant, yeah? We will only discuss one segment of the market today, but if you look at the activities of Rosatom overall, they've been very actively expanding, and as of today, they are present or have deals with 42 countries, and their 10-year portfolio of overseas orders is now larger than all of its Western competitors combined. So the last numbers that I've seen were $133 billion and expanding. So in order to achieve that, they have to be competitive, and they are already competitive, to be sure, especially in uranium mining and in uranium enrichment. So what I'd like to do here is to take you back to the time when Rosatom was trying to buy Uranium One. It's a Canada-based company, and it had assets in the United States, Kazakhstan and Tanzania. Now, there was a lot of coverage of the issue, and many people assumed that the reason why Rosatom is trying to buy the company is in order to exercise influence, over the U.S. Nuclear, and so the U.S. assets were somehow believed to be more important than all the other international assets. But if you look at it, Rosatom was buying them because Uranium One has the lowest production costs in mining natural uranium anywhere in the world, and that is in Kazakhstan. That only applies to the Kazakh assets. In fact, after Rosatom bought Uranium One, some of the US assets, some of the US mines were closed down. So the reason why they were buying it was for the Kazakh assets. It wasn't at all for the US assets. But the emphasis was so misplaced, and it was really interesting to see that not one piece of analysis that I saw picked up on the fact that Kazakh costs of uranium mining were significantly lower, and that, if you look a year on, has driven up Russia's numbers. Firstly, production of uranium increased. significantly. So in total, they now control 13% of global production. 5,000 of this 7,900 tons comes from abroad, and the bulk of it comes from Kazakhstan. So, that has driven that number up, and production costs have gone down, and Russia has been able to go up in its ranking, so going back to the objective of becoming a top 3 leader in every segment of the global market. In terms of uranium production, Russia was able to rise from number 6 to number 4. So you can see that really the analysis that we've seen in the West was so flawed on this. Controversial acquisition, therefore, wasn't as controversial and had economic interests at heart. Likely scenarios for the region. So very quickly, we have seen that Russia, China, and the West will have some presence across the region. The balance of power will be important. The presence of the West has become much more sporadic than back in the early 2000s, but it will become even more so, most likely. Russia and China, by contrast, have been able to work out some of their differences. They will continue to compete. Nonetheless, there are some areas where they can genuinely cooperate. Working with regional elites of Central Asia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, you can see I've excluded Georgia here. So obviously, after the Georgia war, I think it was a very strong signal, and countries such as Azerbaijan moderated their pro-Western rhetoric quite significantly, and they share a lot of the interests with regional elites in Russia, so we should expect that cooperation to continue. Caspian divided according to the modified median line. As I said, this principle would not be new in the Caspian, and so it's probably the easiest and the quickest way to sort things out. Nonetheless, having said that, I have interviewed people on different sides, including Turkmenistan and in Tehran, where they're quite prepared for things to take a long time. So I think now that the convention is there, they understand that they can start working things out, and obviously this whole convention has been incredibly difficult to sell in the Tehran parliament. There was also some public outcry that Tehran kind of sold out national interest, that the concessions that it made were simply too great. Caspian to feature prominently in Russian military strategy. Now, this is very, very important. The military strategy has been rapidly developing in the last years, and Caspian has become an integral part of it. So it's also close to the regions which are strategically important to Russia. Let me take you back to 2015, when Russia used the Caspian to fire on targets in Syria, and it used caliber cruise missiles to hit targets in Syria. According to the convention, it can do so again, because there's nothing in the convention that precludes Russia from using the waters of the Caspian, outside the 25-mile zone, territorial waters plus fishing zones. And Russia is free to operate on the surface of the water. So as long as the attacks are not directed against coastal states, Russia will be able to hit targets outside the region, in the regions which are important to it, such as the Middle East. Let's leave it at that, because conscious of time again. Energy interests to remain important, but subordinate to geopolitical and military considerations across the region. I think all the states understand that, and all the companies operating in the region understand that. So this has been very consistently reinforced by the Putin administration since the 2000s. Differentiated, sophisticated policy for the region will continue. So I think this is one thing that we need to take away from this lecture, that it's not, for Russia, it's not just sporadic, it's not just incoherent. It's in fact quite effective because it's been thought through. And there's quite a lot of strategic thinking that has gone into how Russia will approach the region. Investment climate, I think I will not dwell on this at all, and you can just ask me in the in the follow-up discussion. But the key is that since the collapse, after the oil prices collapsed and before they recovered, in 2014, many states embarked on implementing reforms to diversify their economies. Obviously, that applies to the states like Azerbaijan, which remained very undiversified. Georgia is an absolute leader in this category. In fact, Georgia was one of only 3 lower and middle income economies in the world that were included in the top 50 economies ranked by the Doing Business 2019 report. That report, by the way, was released in October, so it was interesting to see that Georgia made it that high up, but it's not because it's been very consistent that they've been trying to improve investment climate. All the other countries have made some progress, but only very incremental, and I think these are good examples of just how incremental progress has been. Armenia simplified post-registration procedures, for example, tax, licensing, social security, post-registration for companies has been easier. Azerbaijan has started offering better protection for minority investors. We really can discuss that in more detail, but there is agreement, overall consensus that this has been the case. It also improved insolvency procedures. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have started engaging in trade a bit more, and there have been some agreements to back up that sort of cross-border trade. Let's not forget that the Uzbek leadership changed, and the new president is much keener to open Uzbekistan to trade, to international trade, but he starts with regional trade, obviously. Uzbekistan adopted electronic platforms to simplify procedures. So again, all very, very incremental. And in terms of opportunities, the main opportunities, I would say, are again in oil and gas. And again, if we agree that the Southern Caspian is to be divided, then quite a few of the contested fields which have laid frozen for so many years may become real opportunities. If they agree on the joint development, it's still unclear how foreign investors will be attracted to the region. But we know, for example, the case of Azerbaijan shows that the governments try to encourage the entry of new companies, partly because the ACG, the Azeri-Chirag Guneshli fields, which provide something like 75% of Azerbaijan's output, have been maturing and declining faster than expected, according to the analysis done some years ago. So they're quite keen to stimulate investment and accelerate output growth. And then in the very long term, like I said, there might be some potential for gas transit from Central Asia. At the moment, the gas transit opportunities that I see are those to China. I don't really see an opportunity for Turkmen gas or any other Central Asian gas going to Europe. And then finally, it came to my attention that some free trade zones have been developing in the region, such as an international sea trade port. I also understand that while legislation has just been introduced in Azerbaijan to develop that port, investment has already been made. And it's from the UAE. So, Trasica has been fairly active. The numbers I've seen is that about 180 different projects have been implemented across the region in the last few years. And North-South Transport Corridor is a new thing that has been developing. So I think the risks remain, that those are all the risks that you know about, their corruption, and maybe not so much open bribery anymore, but irregular application of law and regulation, harassment by tax authorities, unexpected audits or inspections, and I've also been made aware of some criminal charges that have been brought up in civil disputes, clearly used as a pressure tactic. So also a risk that I see is the legislative changes that have been introduced in states across the region, and I've picked up that some of them do not have, in fact often they don't have the grandfathering clauses, which then makes it a lot riskier for investors. Restrictions on investment have been introduced in some countries. You obviously know about the strategic legislation, strategic deposits legislation in Russia. And so a very similar legislation was introduced in Kazakhstan in 2014. And how exactly it's applied remains to be seen. In fact, the government retains quite a lot of arbitrary power in how it applies this legislation. Nonetheless, the fact that it was introduced is quite significant and also is a source of risk. So I think I'll leave it at that.